Hi everyone, my name is Attuned and I am a senior diplomacy student. I'm going to be your student MC for tonight, and I'm going to start us off by introducing the song that we're going to listen to tonight. So the great American author Ralph Ellison wrote that art, the blues, the spirituals, the jazz, the dance was what we had in place of freedom. And by we mean the African American community. Each night of our symposium has begun by examining some dimension of the desire for racial justice as it is expressed in music. This evening, we begin our final night together by listening to We Shall Overcome. It's a gospel song sung by the Glee Club of Morehouse College, which is the alma mater of Martin Luther King Jr. It has also become a song of protest and the anthem of the civil rights movement.
Someday. So beautiful. Good evening, brothers and sisters. My name is Father Colin Kay. I am your Director of Campus Ministry on the South Orange campus of Seton Hall, and also your Interim Vice President for Mission and Ministry. It's good to be with you tonight. Let's take a moment. First things first. From the book of Revelation. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away." And he who was seated on the throne said, "Behold, I am making all things new."
Good evening.
Brothers and sisters, we are the lucky ones. We can breathe in communion with all those who are ill, in solidarity with all those who hunger and thirst for righteousness and justice. Join me, please, in a few moments of silent prayer, breathing faithfully and hopefully. Good Lord, giver of every breath, bless us, protect us from all harm, and guide us safely to that place and to that time where death shall be no more, when mourning and crying and pain shall be no more, when all the former painful, unjust things have passed away. Good Lord, help us with you to make all things new. Amen.
Good evening. I'm the Reverend Dr. Forrest Pritchett, proud member of the administration and faculty here at Seton Hall for the past 42 years. As I reflect upon the glorious sounds from the Morehouse Glee Club, many of you may ask, why do we use music in the beginning of these programs? Well, there's a theological as well as a historical response I'd like to give. Theologically, in the Bible, when God gave commandments to the generals of army, the people who would fight his battles, God would ask them to put the psalmists, the singers, in the front of the army as they would march toward the enemy. And as such, this is always a sign that God is with those who go in his name. A historical dimension of music in the front of programming comes to me from the 1960s, when people like myself were, as students, joined an organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in which college students all over the nation stepped up to march alongside of people like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. One of our colleagues was John Lewis. We were all young college students marching to make America a better place. So we're so pleased that we can join with Dr. Greg Floyd and the Center for Catholic Studies in helping to launch this effort this evening. We know that this is one of those moments that you can read about in the book of Ecclesiastes. This is the season for change. This is the season for righteousness. And we are all called to be our best selves, not to be silent, but to step forward and to represent all that is good and righteous on this earth. I'm now pleased to introduce the new director of the Center for Catholic Studies at Seton Hall University, Dr. Greg Floyd.
Thank you, Reverend Pritchett. Good evening, Seton Hall, and welcome to the final night of our inaugural Faith in the Public Square series on faith and racial justice. As a few of you have heard me say earlier nights this week, my hope is that we can do this regularly, each fall, gathering as a university community, students, faculty, staff, priests, and administrators to reflect on timely issues at the intersection of faith and our shared political life together. And that this wouldn't just be informative, but transformative, a yearly opportunity to recommit ourselves to live well and justly with one another as fellow neighbors, fellow citizens, and fellow pilgrims. Our topic this week is a timely one, as timely as this afternoon. Few themes, if any, have divided our nation historically and presently as those of race, racism, and the still unfulfilled promissory note of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all Americans. Yet despite that, we remain caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, and so we cannot avoid these conversations either, nor should we desire to, and especially not at a university, and certainly not at a Catholic university. Faith and reason, each of these from out of their own resources, demand an honest confrontation with reality, in which nothing is spared and nothing overlooked. No problem is too inveterate, no issue too big, no idea too controversial, no human life too small or too marginal. So tonight we undertake together, I hope, the characteristic work of a university, to question and investigate realities that are pressing upon us, and in doing so, to become better neighbors, better scholars, better believers, and better citizens by listening to each other. Our evenings this week, of which this is the fourth, have followed a pattern of self-transcendence laid out by the philosopher, theologian, and Catholic priest Bernard Lonergan. According to that pattern, authentic human development, what he calls self-transcendence, can only begin when we stop to pay attention to our own experience and to that of others, to then come to understand the meaning of those experiences and judge the adequacy, the inadequacy, or the partiality of our own insights into them. But finally, we only achieve authenticity fully when we decide to act in response to the truth and in accord with love. Attention, understanding, judgment, decision, and action. These have always struck me as the goals for any classroom, as well as any human life. And so tonight, on our fourth and final night, we seek to come to decisions about how to act, to take responsibility for the work of racial justice in our society, but as a number of our speakers have reminded us, also in our own hearts. I would like to thank our co-sponsors from across the university, campus ministry, the core program, student services, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, religious studies, and the law school. The diversity of these sponsors reminds us that our campus is populated with people of goodwill, and that despite our differences and even amidst our disagreements, we can still collaborate in the pursuit of truth and justice, that we can be thermostats and not merely thermometers for change, and ultimately, in Dr. King's memorable phrase, that we can one and all be extremists for love. And so, speaking of people of goodwill, it is my pleasure this evening to welcome someone who has already done much to bring our campus community together, our Vice President of Student Services, Dr. Shauna Cooper Gibson. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Floyd. Good evening, Seton Hall community, and welcome to our guests this evening. As the Vice President of Student Services, I manage many different areas of responsibility. On any given day, we will be hosting a job fair through our Career Center, a drive-in movie through student engagement, co-host a diversity, equity, and inclusion training, or prepare students for midterms through our Academic Resource Center. We are constantly striving to make our students feel welcomed, supported, and included by creating a premier student experience. Student Services knows how important each student is. My time is also spent in Executive Cabinet working with my peers on items such as updating our strategic plan. Executive Cabinet duties are more broad-reaching and nuanced, but the goals are the same. The leadership at Seton Hall is also highly committed to student engagement, success, and instilling a strong sense of belonging. The Executive Cabinet, faculty, the priest community also know how important students are. Some of the shared goals between Cabinet and Student Services have been shifted to the forefront as we navigate through so many social, national, and international occurrences. There are major wildfires raging in California, an uneven COVID-19 response around the globe. There's continued national unrest following the tragic deaths of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, George Floyd in Minneapolis, and so many others before and after them. We must remain steadfast in fulfilling Seton Hall's commitment as we work to uphold our Catholic devotion to peace, justice, and the dignity of all human life. Let me be very, very clear with all of you. You matter to us. What you think, how you feel, what you experience in the world around us is vital data that informs and colors the entire Seton Hall community. That is why a series like this is so essential. We cannot support academic minds without also valuing your existence, modeling civic engagement in the time of a civil unrest, and engage in difficult but extremely necessary conversations. As we build the strategic plan, one of the questions we asked are there new directions which Seton Hall should pursue? I believe our work here today is an indication of that purpose. If Black, Muslim, Hispanic, Asian, or differently abled students cannot feel at home and welcomed here, how do we expect them to embrace and reflect back on our core mission and values out in the world? Inclusion starts here. As Vice President for Mission and Ministry says, there are no strangers here. I'm inspired by how many students, priests, faculty, and staff have come together to add to this conversation and move us forward, but we must and have to move forward. I appreciate being part of the progress that is so essential to Seton Hall's future, and I'm so grateful for our panel and discussions this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper Gibson. During my time at the Seton Hall University, I'm just so pleased to be a part of this effort and to welcome our guest presenter for the evening. Before we do, I'd like to call everyone's attention to how you may be interactive after our guest presenter has spoken. If you look at the toolbar, which you may see on your screen, if you move your cursor, you'll see a box to the right with a question mark in it. You may place your questions there, and after his presentation, we will be able to direct some of those questions to his attention. You know, in my roles now as advisor to the Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as well as Director of Special Projects for Student Services Division and Director of the MLK program, I am extremely pleased this evening to present one of my, in a sense, comrade in arms, Dr. Andrew Prevot, who comes to us from Boston College at the present time. He did all of his graduate work in systematic theology at the University of Notre Dame, both his master's and his Doctor of Philosophy degree. And the systematic theology is a pretty tough subject, so we're quite sure he's going to help to break down some of those components as he adds it to his analysis today. But at Boston College, he also has prepared a number of volumes, which writings, one entitled The Mysticism of Ordinary Life, and that would get you thinking an awful lot. One of my favorites is The Theology and Race, which looks at the traditions of Blacks and womanist philosophical and theological traditions. And his last book, Thinking Prayer, Theology and Spirituality in the Midst of Modernity, Modern Life. It is now my pleasure to present and introduce to many Dr. Andrew Prevot of Boston College. Thank you.
Hello, it's a true honor and pleasure to be here with you all virtually this evening. Thanks to all of the organizers of such an important event, such an important discussion of faith and racial justice. And the task that's been given to me is to talk a little bit about decision and action. I just want to stop and say it's tough to know what to do sometimes. It's tough to know what choices will actually make a difference in the world. And that's okay. If you're at this moment feeling at a loss about what to do, I think you have a lot of company there. And so the first thing I want to say really is that you don't have to do anything alone. This is the struggle against racial injustice that we're seeing unfold this summer and over the last several years in this country. In fact, for many decades and generations, is not something that any single individual is responsible for by themselves. It's always going to be a group effort. So my first piece of advice is simply to find others who share your passion for this struggle and to get involved with the organizations that they care about and that they believe in and that they're putting work into. We don't have to reinvent the wheel here. There are already a lot of communities engaged in a struggle, and the important thing is to get involved, to join together with others. I would also say, though, there are things you can do by yourself, in your dorm room or in your house, and those might be things like, for instance, reflecting on your own life, on your family, on your background, on ways in which the racial structures of our world have shaped your experience, have affected your chances for success, whether positively or negatively, and to just spend some time in self-reflection about those things. And if you're a believing person, to take those reflections and bring them before God and pray that God will give you not only insight into who you are, but also strength to live into your vocation in this world, because God calls all of us to a life of holiness, and that holiness will include important decisions, concrete decisions in each person's life oriented toward the common good. So those are just some general thoughts I have about what to do. But with the rest of my time, I want to talk a little bit more about what not to do. And I thought this might be a helpful way to proceed. So I'm going to use this chalkboard behind me to put up my top 5 things not to do in the midst of our current kind of moment of racial reckoning. So the first one, I'll just write up on the board. don't confuse race with biocultural diversity. Now, what is the difference here? Biocultural diversity refers to the wondrous fact that all of our bodies are different. No one of us has the same exact hair, eyes, nose, ears, teeth. Every detail of our bodies is different. We all have slightly different skin tones, different voices, and those voices inflect the way we use language. We all grow up in different contexts where we eat different foods, where we sing different songs, where we have different rituals and traditions and so on. If you were to try to count all of the ways in which human beings differ biologically and culturally throughout the world and throughout all of time, it would be an impossible task. There'd be so many variations that it would just boggle the mind. And this is a reflection of the infinite goodness and beauty of God, of our benevolent creator. So biocultural diversity is a fact of human existence that should really make us stop and show reverence to the beauty and the divine image that's in each of us. By contrast, race is a modern invention. It's a system of social control. It's something that was designed for a violent purpose. The idea of race in its earliest inception presupposed that all of that wondrous biocultural diversity can be reduced down into 4 major groups. And they were ranked hierarchically according to this theory. So you have Europeans at the top, Asians on the rung below that, Native Americans third, and at the very bottom, those of African descent. And the theory was the closer you are to the top of this racial hierarchy, the more intelligent you are, the more capable of self-government, and the more moral you would be. By contrast, the lower you are, the worse you're going to be, the most ignorant, the most irrational, the most immoral. So this was a view of the world that suggested, in order to draw a picture of life, all you need is a Crayola box with 4 colors. And the values of those colors are already preset. It was a very simplistic model, but that was with a design. The design was, it was something that European intellectual, cultural, and political elites came up with to justify practices of imperialism, of colonialism, of the exploitation of labor, including forms of slavery and slave trade. It was used to justify the rape of Black and Indigenous women. It was used to justify all kinds of horrific violence. Now you might think, okay, well, if race is so bad, maybe we should just try to get beyond it. Maybe we should stop talking about race. But that won't work either, because this instrument of social control that's been in the works for the last 500 years or so has been very effective. It shaped the world that we live in. And so the world as we know it has been deeply formed through this racial imaginary. So we have to respond to it. So whatever you do, whatever decisions you make, you should, on the one hand, not confuse race with biocultural diversity. They're different things. But on the other hand, you should not use that as an excuse to ignore the problems that this idea of race have caused for so many centuries. All right, on to the second point. Don't misunderstand Dr. King, that is, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I say that because his name is invoked quite a lot, and I think to often paint a false picture of what he stood for and what he was about. And there are 2 points in particular that I would like to contest, because I think if we can get Dr. King's legacy right, then we'll be in a much better place today with our struggle for racial justice. So the first point is that we often hear this quote from his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, and in which he talks about his desire or his dream that one day his children will live in a nation where they're judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now, I've seen it many times where someone will take this passage and use it to suggest that King wants us to not see one another's color, that he wants us to move beyond the idea of race altogether and live in a colorblind society where we don't have to talk about race anymore. But that's a profound misunderstanding of Dr. King's message. And the reason is that the content of our character is not just some mysterious, invisible thing inside of each of us. It's determined by how we're acting in the world as it exists here and now. So if you live in a world where people are being discriminated against because of their race, and you decide you're going to ignore that topic and not do anything about it, what kind of character do you have? Dr. King would say that's a vicious way to be in the world. If you really want to be virtuous, it's necessary to come to terms with race as a structure of social control and to fight vigorously against it. So Dr. King was not in favor of a colorblind approach to politics, although he was in favor of developing a strong moral character. The second way he's misunderstood is he's often presented as though his main goal was to just be very friendly and nice and to make everyone feel comfortable and to not ruffle any feathers. You know, he's kind of like a nice, jovial guy that just wants us all to get along. That's also a profound distortion. It is true that Dr. King promoted a method of nonviolent direct action, and he was against the taking up of arms, weapons, guns, for the racial justice struggle, because he believed that would not be effective and it was not the best form of Christian witness. However, his methods of nonviolent direct action were geared toward resisting the status quo, upsetting the powers that be, forcing people to deal with aspects of their society that aren't correct. So he wanted to cause trouble, he wanted to cause disruption, so that those things would shed a light on the deeper problems in society. So when we think about Dr. King, we should remember that our character has something to do with how we deal with problems of racial injustice. And that although we should use nonviolent forms of resistance, those should really be disruptive to the world. And if people are just really comfortable with them, you're probably not doing it right. You're not really following King's example. Okay, let me put up now my third point. Don't misconstrue property damage. In the protests after the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many others this summer, there have been many nonviolent demonstrations. But also sometimes after curfew, property has been damaged. Buildings have been burnt, storefront windows have been broken, police cars have been set on fire, the graffiti has been put on walls, these sorts of things. Now, the news media will often suggest, will describe these events by saying protests became violent. And so they're presenting this property damage as a form of violence. And in some sense it is, because it often does cause harm to the people who own those businesses, or it can hurt people in various ways. But I just want to make a few crucial points about this. Number one, the vast majority of those participating in these protests have not been engaged in this kind of activity. Mostly what I've seen people doing is marching, is singing, is chanting, is demanding justice, using their words, is praying. These are all things that are not violent. Even if they're disruptive to our ordinary life, they are not hurting anyone. In fact, they're trying to make the violence stop. Another point would be, there are other actors involved here who have other agendas. So sometimes, outside people will be infiltrating these Black Lives Matter movement demonstrations and causing a greater deal of the damage, whether for political reasons or for some other motive. So we have to remember these are not all the same group or the same group of people. I would also say that I don't believe that such property damage is the most effective way to get a message across. So I'm against it, not only because it might hurt someone, but also because I think it's not the most effective strategy, because it can be easily used to try to discredit the movement. However, even though I don't necessarily approve of it, I do understand it in a sense. And let me try to explain my understanding of it. The point that I take away is that until we care as much about Black people's lives as we do about these inanimate things and objects, we will be in bad shape as a country. So let me say that again. Unless and until we care about Black people's lives as much as we do about inanimate objects, we are not free. We are stuck in a dehumanizing condition as a society. And so if your first knee-jerk reaction to seeing this property damage is to suggest, is to wonder, well, why are they destroying that property? That is wrong. But you haven't said a single thing about the lives that have been destroyed, not only by recent police killings, but also by mass incarceration, by redlining, by voter disenfranchisement and voter suppression, by economic deprivation, by healthcare systems and education systems that regularly fail Black men, women, and children, by the long history of Jim Crow, by, of course, the long history of slavery. If you have not said a single word about any of that violence, and yet you are up in arms about some minor property damage or even significant property damage, you are distorting reality. All right, you are participating in a false view of things where a broken window is deemed violent, but hundreds of years of racial violence against the Black community in America is papered over or ignored. So in order to really understand Dr. King well, it's also important to understand the current protests well, and to recognize that even if there were some unfortunate aspects of them, that would not be ideal, that does not actually discredit the movement overall. And we need to get at the root problems here, which is the history of anti-Black racism that we're still living through in this country. All right, let me now put up my fourth thing not to do. Do not rely too much on Twitter. And this would go for other forms of social media, such as Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, whatever it might be. Now, I have a complicated attitude toward all of these things. On the one hand, they can be effective tools for mobilization. They are really good at getting slogans out there and helping people to know, okay, an event is happening here or it's happening there. And sometimes there are places where people can frankly just vent their emotion about things that are going on, and that can be helpful or necessary. However, I do think that there's a danger here of us prioritizing these social media spaces too much. I think that if you're using them to educate yourself about an issue, that's not a very good strategy, because you're never going to get the full picture by just reading short little snippets that are designed to be as kind of catchy or confrontational as possible. It's important to actually go to the library and check out books. It's important to have longer face-to-face conversations with people, hopefully in a socially distanced manner at the moment, in which you can really get into the issues in a more kind of open-ended and genuinely inquisitive manner. Also, in terms of expression, self-expression, I would encourage you not to only settle for going on social media and letting your thoughts be known. Think about other forms of human expression throughout history that have been effective. Think about writing music or poetry. Think about writing a short story or a novel, or an essay, or submitting a letter to an editor of a newspaper. Think about other ways in which you can express yourself that allow for greater complexity, greater nuance, and probably greater impact in the long run. So although these social media tools can be helpful, I do worry that they can also promote a kind of unhelpful polarization and oversimplification of the fights that we have right now, where the algorithms are designed to just show you things that they think you already would like based on things you've already seen. And so you're not getting a full exposure to the argument. And we're being trained by these social media platforms to lose our capacity for critical thinking. Even when we have the right slogans and when we have the right positions, are we really thinking deeply about the issues, or are we simply repeating things that we've seen, or retweeting them, or as it's called? So I see this a lot with some of my students, and again, I'm not saying don't use it, I'm saying don't rely too much on it, because I think that there's other things that we need to focus on if we're going to really change the world for the better. Okay, let me put my last one up. Don't succumb to shame. This is perhaps the most important one. What is shame? Shame is an attitude toward yourself in which you feel unworthy of love, in which you feel just bad all over, in which you feel like maybe you don't matter, like you are nothing, or like there's something just deeply, deeply wrong with you. And I think one of the most pernicious effects of this long history of race as a system of social control, this long history of white supremacy, is that it makes people feel ashamed about themselves, and particularly about their bodies. And by the way, this happens not only to Black people and other people of color, but also to white people too. The evil of this thing is that it can make all of us feel ashamed about ourselves. Remember the point about biocultural diversity, that's what really reflects the beauty and goodness of God. We should not be ashamed, we should celebrate and be in awe of our bodies and all of our rich differences. but instead race makes us feel ashamed, and in different ways. So if you're a Black person and you kind of see what's been going on in the world, it's easy to feel, and I mean, I'm African American myself, and I can feel this way, like, you know, people don't really care about you that much, despite what you think, what they say, you know, and it's easy to feel like maybe your life doesn't really matter, or like it's time to give up hope, or any number of things, and you can begin to look in the mirror and be sort of you know, ashamed of your own body if you're not careful. And this is something that needs to be resisted very vigorously every day. I mean, it sounds corny, but I actually think it's not a bad idea to get up in the morning, look in the mirror, and go ahead and say some affirming words about yourself, about your body and how it looks, and about your character and the things that you believe in, the things you stand for, the things that you're going to do that day. You know, all of these systems are trying to make us feel badly about ourselves, and that's counterproductive. But also, I've noticed this in a number of my white students, where these conversations can make them feel shame too. They can make them feel ashamed about their family, of origin, about their skin color, about their positions of privilege. And they don't always know what to do with those feelings. Sometimes they get defensive and say, well, maybe, you know, this isn't an issue we should care about. There's a lot of anxiety about not being perceived as a racist by others, you know, and what if I say the wrong thing accidentally or do the wrong thing accidentally, but I didn't mean anything by it. I don't want to be put on the spot and accused of racism. You know, I don't want to be called a Karen or something like that. So these feelings are real. And I want to say, first of all, that those feelings that white people sometimes have in response to these racial issues should not be the center of the movement for racial justice. And if they start to occupy the central concern and all of the violence against Black people and other people of color gets marginalized, that's going to be a huge problem. So that's a non-starter for me. But on the other hand, I would say they do need to be given some space to be heard and then worked through and moved beyond. Because feelings of guilt and shame that you just have about yourself are not productive for anyone else, nor are they productive for your own life. So it's important to acknowledge and name those feelings when you have them, but then find ways to overcome them. And again, one of the most important things you can do in that regard is to not engage this struggle alone. To find friends, to find community, to find organizations that you can get involved with, and to associate your sense of self, not merely with the color of your skin, but with the content of your character. But remember that content of character is about your action. It's about the actions that are building you up as a person over the course of your life. And in a world characterized by a system of social control that we call race or racism, those actions better be working against that unjust system, at least most of the time. You know, maybe not everything you do during the day has to be about that, but some of the stuff you do should be. And that will help you to build up a strong character, and then you can take pride in that character that you've built up through your actions. It doesn't make any sense to be proud of the history of white people in the country at large. You know, there are movements to say, well, what about white pride? White people need to be proud too. And I want to say, well, you can't actually be proud of this history of discrimination and oppression that white people in America are responsible for. You cannot be proud of that and say that Black Lives Matter at the same time. Those are incompatible things. But I do want white people to be able to feel proud in themselves because of the hard work that they do to try to dismantle that system and to create a better future that is more inclusive for all Americans, regardless of our biological and cultural differences, and non-Americans as well. All human beings who are created in the image and likeness of God. And I want Black people and people of color to recognize that, you know, although there are political structures that need to change, and although we have to fight those things, it's also important to take some time to care for ourselves, to tend to our mental and emotional health and needs, and to love our own bodies. You know, and that might mean sometimes taking a couple of days off from the fight and just doing some things that you love to do that give you joy and that feed your soul. So please, 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 if you forget the other 4 things, which I hope you don't, at the very least, remember this last one. Do not let yourself succumb to shame. So with that, I think I will close. I know there will be time for some questions to come, but thank you all for your attention, and I'll look forward to hearing your questions.
I want to thank you, Dr. Prevot, for speaking with us about all these important matters, especially in the context that we are in a current movement to achieve racial justice, and all the important things to keep in mind. I want to remind everybody to, if you have a question, to please drop in your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll start our discussion now.
Burke, I can kick it off here. Dr. Prevot, thank you very much for your talk. I'm going to paraphrase some of the questions we already have lined up here in the chat for you. Alejandra asked a question that was similar to the one I had written down. Your distinction between or about the content of character, what concretely might that look like today? She asked, how can we set an example of this, of Dr. King's message?
Good. Yeah. Well, you know, if King were alive today, if he had not been assassinated, you know, shot in the face, which is just still a haunting thing for me. You know, and if he were alive, he would be front and center in these movements that we're seeing on the streets. You know, there's no doubt in my mind that he would be doing whatever he could in terms of nonviolent direct action to raise awareness about the racial injustice that's going on, and to pressure those who have the power to do something about it to change things. Another thing I would say concretely is to make sure you vote, and to get as many people as you can to go vote in the upcoming elections, and at all levels, national and local. And, you know, if you care about these issues, prioritize that when you're evaluating the candidates. You know, what are people's track record in terms of caring about criminal justice reform, in terms of caring about, you know, equality, in terms of education and housing opportunities and healthcare and all of these kinds of things. These are all life issues that deserve our moral attention when we go vote. I would also say, you know, again, don't reinvent the wheel. Do some research and look up organizations where you live that are doing work in your neighborhoods and your communities, and find some time to get involved, whether through your own financial resources or through time that you can contribute volunteering, or, you know, in any other kind of way. You know, maybe it's as simple as finding some time to tutor some young kids who are in poor communities and are struggling with their schoolwork. You know, all of us can play a part if we're looking for creative local solutions.
Very good. Dr. Prevot, I'd like to, Garciella sends in a question which reads, would you agree that the companies which were negatively impacted during the rioting and looting, they could easily make their money back, but the lives that were lost are more important because they cannot be brought back?
Yes, I would agree with that, generally speaking. Now, there may be an example of a company that's so devastated by some property damage that, you know, the company doesn't survive. But still, that is less important than a life which has been lost. And so that question is really getting at, you know, one of my main points there, which is that the real violence we need to be paying attention to is the violence that is literally destroying people's lives, making it so people no longer even exist, or making it so that they their lives are damaged in very deep ways. And by the way, that would include people who aren't Black. You know, I think sometimes there's a confusion where this phrase Black Lives Matter makes people think that what we're saying is people whose lives are not Black don't matter, but that does not follow logically. A positive statement does not imply that its contrary is you know, or that its converse is false. So what I want to say here basically is that we're focusing on Black lives because of the just centuries of harm that are being done to them. And that's the real violence. And it's so much greater in scope than the property damage we've witnessed.
Andrew, I will follow up on that with a question we had about kind of the interrelatedness of social justice as a concept in Black Lives Matter, and sort of that social justice grows out of the Christian, indeed the Catholic encyclical tradition. In some sense, it's now a much broader concept. So what would you say to a Catholic who has reservations, maybe even very strong ones, about the sort of formal platform of the institution of Black Lives Matter, and or some of its philosophical and critical underpinnings, say a certain avowed Marxism by some of its members and founders, who and the way that that might be in conflict with other positions they hold, but who still desires to sort of have a place in the pursuit of social justice and racial justice in particular?
Yeah, well, you know, one of the difficult things when you're dealing with a country that forms these political platforms is very few of them completely align with Catholic social teaching. Mm-hmm. And so if you're a Catholic who's trying to kind of follow the letter of the law, it's you have to make strategic alliances with different organizations to the best of your ability. And it's rare that you will find one about which you could not raise any moral questions from a Catholic perspective. But that does not excuse inaction or lack of involvement. Mm-hmm. If you know, unless you have a better alternative, like, can you point to a movement that's more likely to succeed in bringing about racial justice that's on the ground right now that we should be putting our weight behind? If not, then this is what we've got, and it's important to support it as best we can, and maybe, if possible, to, you know, if there are concerns about specific issues, to work to, you know, organize with people and explain your perspective, and maybe you'll have your voice heard within those conversations. But you can't do that unless you're actually working together towards some common goal. Now, I would also say regarding Marxism that that's often used as a kind of bad word. You know, people think it means Soviet-style Stalinist Russia and things like that. But you know, Marxism is a very complicated intellectual legacy, and many things that people like in our country are in part because of the influence of some of Marxist ideas. Things like widespread public education, like Medicaid and Medicare, like Social Security, like a 5-day work week, like health benefits for workers, and all of these kinds of things have a kind of Marxist pedigree. So I think we need to be careful about words that are being used to ridicule and dismiss rather than to promote greater understanding and complexity of understanding.
Okay, so for our next question, it was, how can we properly use social media in order to educate ourselves and others on important issues? What additional resources are effective in educating ourselves?
Okay, so I want to start a hashtag, hashtag go to the library. Now, are closed right now or have limited access, but a lot of stuff is being put online. But I would say in addition to social media, I'm not saying don't use social media, but I'm saying in addition to it, go to the library and use the search boxes to put in terms that you are interested in. You know, type in racial justice, type in anti-blackness, type in, you know, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Type in things, you know, that you are interested in learning more about, incarceration, any of these kinds of things, and see what books and scholarly articles are there. And then another thing is when you read a good book that you like, look at its bibliography and check out some of those sources that they were drawing upon. I think we need to be reading more. We need to be reading things that are longer and more demanding of us, and using that to educate ourselves. What I think social media can do is to help mobilize people around simplified versions of some of the ideas. And so social media is still a good tool, but we should just recognize that it's limited and not the only thing we should be doing.
Very good. Norberto writes, Dr. Prevot, in what ways specifically does the colorblind approach prove to be detrimental in achieving racial justice in the United States?
Thank you. That's a very good question. One of the problems with the colorblind approach is that it can sometimes cover over the reality that the world is not yet colorblind. You know, if I could snap my fingers and move us to a place where race never existed and never did exist, and where we just treat everyone as equal, regardless of their biocultural diversity or anything like that, maybe I would do it. But that you just can't simply do that at an institutional level. And so studies have shown, for instance, that when an applicant to a job has the same credentials, but has a black sounding name as opposed to a white sounding name, they're much more likely to be passed over. Similarly, studies have documented that the same thing goes for like real estate applications. If you're looking to rent or buy a home, if you're black, there will be discrimination against you. We see it with police brutality. We see it with the way police are making snap decisions to use lethal force much more frequently with black citizens than with white ones. So all of these things suggest that we need to actually focus on the racial disparities that do exist. And a colorblind ideology prevents us or discourages us from doing that. And so that's my main criticism of it.
Thank you.
This is a question about your second what not to do regarding Martin Luther King. I have often understood Dr. King as aiming at equality because of what we all hold in common, each person as a child of God, like Nelson Mandela's national reconciliation and Mahatma Gandhi's Atman. But today we tend to emphasize what diversifies us, what makes us different from one another. Of course, diversity and commonality are not exclusive of one another. Do you think that this is a misunderstanding of Dr. King's message, the emphasis on sort of common humanity before God?
No, I think that is correct, but I would just be careful not to conclude too many things from that about whether we should be specific in our descriptions of racial disparities or not, because certainly King, although he acknowledges our common humanity and uses that to ground his ethics, and does so in a Christian way. I mean, you know, if you're a Christian, you better believe that every human being is equal in the eyes of God, has equal dignity. And if you don't, that's the first thing you need to go examine in your prayer life before God, why you think that some people are better than others, just in their core. But I just want to suggest that King was very aware still of the diversity in the human experience, of the diverse burden that was being put on a white versus black Americans in his day. And that was equally important to him as our common humanity, I think.
Next question says, is there a way to not be shameful of being selfish or even partially selfish?
Okay, I'm not 100% sure I'm understanding the question correctly, but let me try to do my best with it. I think sometimes we have a misconception about ethics, that ethics means selflessness. You know, that the most virtuous person would be an altruistic person who does not care at all about their own well-being, sacrificing for the other and so forth and so on. But I don't think that's exactly right. I think that ethics means actually, you know, in a Christian sense, love of God, love of neighbor, and love of self. It's all inclusive. You don't have to go out of your way to injure or harm yourself for the sake of some kind of struggle. On the contrary, you have a duty to yourself because you are a human being with dignity in God's eyes. And so therefore, I do think there's place for you know, some forms of self-love, self-care, and so on. But if they're tending towards selfishness, what that connotes for me is a sense that you are making yourself more important than other people, and that you are not actually entering into solidarity with those who are suffering. And that's going to be a problem. All right. So selfishness would be a kind of self-absorption where you don't really acknowledge that you're living in a world with other people whose lives also matter as much as your own does. So I would say self-love, self-care, yes. Selfishness, no. And shame, definitely not.
Thank you, Dr. Prevot. Our next question states, what are your opinions and views on police reform?
This is a tricky one for me. I know that a common slogan today is defund the police. And I think that that is important because I think the allocation of funds in a lot of these city budgets and county budgets and so on needs to be more closely examined. And that there's a lot of things that police are being asked to do that would be better done by a therapist or a social worker or an educator. And by the way, people in all of those fields should be getting compensated at higher rates for the very, very important work that they're doing for our societies. I also think there's an issue with the militarization of the police that we've seen, the way that military-grade weapons that used to be reserved for combat zones, and that's actually another conversation one can have about the amount we're investing in war machinery in our country, but that those are being put on our American streets. And why is that the case? Who stands to benefit from those kinds of funding decisions and that allocation of resources? Would not crime prevention maybe be more effective if we prioritized preventing the kinds of things that lead to criminality in the first place? You know, if we can work on making sure everyone has a fair shot at affordable housing, at good health care, at a stable home environment where there is mental health and social health services readily available, where people have access to food and clean drinking water, and where they're in an educational system that encourages them to succeed and gives them hope that they have a life before them and that their only options are not just some kind of criminal path. You know, the Black community is suffering from two things simultaneously. They're suffering from everyone being treated as if they're a criminal already just because they're Black. That's a huge problem. But they're also suffering from the various levels of economic and political deprivation that are the kind of fertile ground for criminal activity to emerge. You know, if you force people into a state of hopelessness or desperation, then sometimes crime becomes a kind of last resort. So I just think we need a much more effective holistic approach. And after we've done all of that, after we've examined the way that private companies are profiting off of prisons, you know, the prison slave labor issues, the racial bias in our police forces, the fact that white supremacist groups have infiltrated some police forces. Once we deal with all of that, will we still need some regular police officers, to go get the bad guys? I think we will. And so I'm not in favor of police abolition per se, but what I am in favor of is a kind of revolutionary rethinking of the sources of crime in our communities and of the best strategies for really preventing them and for keeping people safe. And I don't think our police forces, the way they are being used now, clearly it's not working. It's not working. Maybe it's working, as it was intended, if the intent was a kind of nefarious white supremacist intent. But if the intent is really to protect and to serve, then I think we need to really explore some new models for how to best do that, and think about it in a comprehensive way.
Our next question is going to ask you about a distinction, or what you think of a distinction between guilt and shame relative to your last point. The author writes, in light of the fact that racism, as our speaker last night affirmed, is a sin, then an appropriate kind of guilt would be a right response if it leads to repentance. So I'm wondering if you could speak to the difference between shame, which is unhealthy, and guilt, which can be not only healthy, but necessary and appropriate.
Yeah, well, a feeling of guilt is when you recognize I've done something wrong, and then you feel badly about it. And that bad feeling has a positive value. What it's supposed to do is to draw your attention to a different way of life or a need for some sort of change in your life. But even guilt is not something you should get stuck in or dwell on. Our God is a God of forgiveness and mercy. And so the important thing is not to just beat yourself up, even if you've done something wrong, but to make amends and to live a better way going forward. So guilt and shame are often distinguished. Shame is a sort of a sense of unworthiness that kind of infects your whole sense of self, whereas guilt is usually about individual things you've done that you feel badly about. I don't think that either one of them is the most important thing to dwell on. I would say that sin, that racism is definitely a sin when you participate in it, but it's also just part of our culture. Brian Massengale talks about this in his book that some of you may have read, that racism is a whole culture. It's just kind of part of the air we breathe in this country. And so there's also a lot of sins of omission where you might not be doing something overtly racist, but you haven't bothered to do anything about the racist environment in which we all live. And so, yeah, maybe you should feel a little guilty if that's the case. But don't get stuck in that guilt. Make a new plan for how you're going to move forward. Make amends. Make reparation for what you've done.
Okay, the next question mentions that they might be confusing race and ethnicity, but they are essentially asking, what makes you say that racism was invented during the colonization period, when before that there have been centuries of wars and oppressions from one ethnicity to another smaller ethnic groups?
Yes, well, that's a very good point. So the idea of race as we experience it in our world today is a modern invention, but violence between groups of people is not a modern invention. It's as old as the human race. And so the problem with this biocultural diversity is when we use our differences, whether of geography or language or appearance or whatever it might be, to start justifying violent acts against one another. That happens very early on, before really history gets going. And so ethnicity is a term that refers usually to groups that have more specific differences. Let me put it this way. An ethnic group is any sort of group of people that can be kind of distinguished from another group. you know, in a sense. So there's many more ethnicities in the world than there are sort of their so-called races. And violence can exist between them. I was thinking about, you know, the conflict in Rwanda between the Hutus and the Tutsis, which is you know, they're both African peoples, but they're two different ethnic groups, and they ended up in a very violent genocidal conflict that was, you know, horrifying. Ethnic conflict like that happens all over the world all the time. And so it's really important to think about not only problems of racism, but also ethnic conflict and how these two things are similar and yet, you know, interconnected with one another.
Okay, the next question deals with probably the concept of leadership. The question reads, who can lead the movement to clearly communicate the ask of society, such as in healthcare, education, justice reform, and the changes the Black community needs to be successful as well?
Yeah, well, one of the interesting things about the current movement as compared to the one in the 1960s is that leadership has become more decentralized. Now there are some leading voices, you know, but leadership is being based more on, you know, who's kind of getting a following, who's being listened to, rather than on kind of having one appointed heroic figurehead person like Dr. King. You know, even at his time, you know, he wasn't standing alone. He was a part of all these organizations, you know, that were fighting for change. And so there was more decentralization in leadership even in his day than sometimes we remember. But today, yeah, you know, decentralization comes with certain trade-offs. So on the one hand, it allows for a very mobile kind of movement that can adapt quickly to local situations. On the other hand, sometimes there can be a sense of disorganization rather than organization that can be felt, where it seems like we can't all get on the same page about what we're doing. But I do think that there are some points of consensus across the different sectors of this racial justice struggle. And so the need for a kind of strong single figurehead type of leader might be overstated by some people who lament the loss of that type of leadership. But I don't know, this is a good open question to keep thinking about. And many of the students here, you know, one of the things you might think about is what leadership roles can you take in some of the institutions and organizations and clubs that you're a part of in order to address any concerns related to racial justice that might arise. You know, I think leadership is not something we should just reserve for someone else to do. It's something that each of us should be aspiring to in our own particular sphere of influence.
All right, I think this will be I'm going to summarize a few questions and one final question to you. As Alex put it, I'm very interested in the 5 do's. And as Aubrey and Ali said, could you list 1 or 2 concrete ways that we can fight racism or become more attuned and attentive to the needs of social justice on a daily basis?
Good. Yeah, so it's hard for me to know how to specify it because you just literally have to do it. I mean, it's right. It's in some ways it's not that difficult. It's just you pay attention to the way race is affecting anything that you consume or encounter or observe on a daily basis, from the time that you wake up until the time that you go to sleep. And if you see it affecting something in a way that is unjust, then use your voice to say something about it. Look into how you can correct that problem. And that might be happening at local and global levels. But again, don't think that you have to do this by yourself as an individual. It's important to do it together with other people who have shared values and goals with you. And so my advice would be basically to you know, don't try to reinvent the wheel and don't make it too complicated. Look for organizations that are doing good work locally and get involved and talk to the people in them and see, ask them what kinds of things could I do for this particular group right here that would be helpful to you. It might be simple things like, like sending out postcards to potential voters, or it might be, it might be something as simple as, getting together with some friends and saying, okay, we're going to read these 5 books that we got at the library on the history of slavery and try to educate ourselves about that and get together to talk about it. I don't want to overdetermine the steps that you take, because there's not one blueprint for how to proceed. There's a general orientation toward promoting a more just world where everyone's life is treated with the dignity that it deserves. And each of us is responsible to kind of, think carefully about the concrete things that would be most effective in our own local context.
Thank you very much, Dr. Prevot. Let me say one more time on behalf of everyone here how grateful we are to have you with us tonight. It's very clear how lucky your students at Boston College are to have you in the classroom. And let me end our week together here by just thanking a few people quickly. Our student MCs, Gideon, Essence, Mohammed, and Nia tonight. The women and men who've led us in prayer, Luis, Roger, Ali, and Father Colin. Dr. Gloria Thurman for her insight and musical expertise, our various co-sponsors. And I hope you can all join me with your silent golf claps in thanking our core team, Ashley Banks, our graduate student, Reverend Dr. Forrest Pritchett, who has been our intellectual and spiritual guide for these past 4 nights, our retreat master of ceremonies. And of course, the man behind the curtain, who hopefully won't mute me, Mr. Burke Loxley, without whom I'm sure our cameras would have been off when they should have been on and our microphones would have been on when they should have been off. And just to acknowledge that these women and men have given up most of their week as a labor of love for all of us here, the love of truth, the love of justice, and for each of them also the love of God, and we are very grateful to you. So having said that, Reverend Forrest, if you'd like to conclude our evening and our week together with a prayer.
It'd be my pleasure, brother, Dr. Greg Floyd. And might also add, for others, one of my current reads that, from a couple of years ago, this fits in tonight. I just mentioned it for those who are looking for some follow-up, something, as Dr. Prevot said, read something substantial. Reverend Jim Wallace produced a volume called America's Original Sin. I would call it to everyone's attention. Because it also takes a look at the American experience, starting from our encounters with the indigenous population that was already here. And I probably just like to put a little pitch into anyone. If you have any other thoughts, students and others, for any continuing dialogues or programming along these lines, please drop an email on Dr. Floyd so that indeed, I'll read it also if he shares it with me. So I think working along with him, we'd be more than happy to begin to plan additional programming along these lines. I'm now going to call everyone's attention to your screens. You'll be invited to read along with me as I close out with a prayer, which in essence is a scriptural reading. And in a sense, it's also a motivational and leadership guidepost for all of us. It is a message written thousands of years ago, but it will stand the test of time. It will be here long after our footprints are gone. But the word of God is eternal. A reading from Micah. Listen to what the Lord says. Stand up, plead my case before the mountains. Let the hills hear what you have to say. Hear, you mountains, the Lord's accusation. Listen, you everlasting fountains of the earth. For the Lord has a case against his people. He is lodging a charge against Israel. I brought you out of Egypt, he says, and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, and also Aaron and Miriam. Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for our transgressions, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. God bless you all. Until we meet again, may God be with us. Thank you.